for now, I'd like to introduce or call to the podium Bruno Clarke, who will talk about what he's planning to talk about. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for that lovely introduction. So I hope people can, some of the print is going to be kind of fine, but just let me know if something is crucial that you can't quite make out. So I'm just going to dive right in, and if anything's not clear, then we'll try to clear it up in our conversation. I've rolled my personal statement about how did I get into this sort of thing into the talk itself. So I'll just kick it off, and but also let me not forget to say thank you to the organizers and the association. I'm happy to be back here. I was at the 50th anniversary meeting 10 years ago, and I'm glad we're back here today. So, archiving the Systems Countercultures Archive in search of organic cybernetics. So in the mid to late 1970s, my graduate curriculum in English and comparative literature at SUNY Buffalo was dominated by interdisciplinary, philosophical, and theoretical approaches to literary study. Buffalo's high theory vibe did prime my eventual dive into the greater world of cybernetics, no doubt, but as far as archival scholarship goes, not so much. Nonetheless, some years later, halfway along the tenure track at Texas Tech University, I stumbled into the archive on my own. Researching the early writings of D.H. Lawrence and William Carlos Williams, I discerned an overlooked overlap on the somewhat forgotten figure of Dora Marsden. Ever hear of her? You haven't? No. Well, it turned out that Marsden was a militant British suffragette who, during a hunger strike while incarcerated for trespassing, was gripped by a philosophical vision that induced her transformation from a suffragist feminist politico into a polemicist and little magazine editor who cultivated a libertarian discourse of radical individualism in a series of journals published in London running from 1911 to 1919. These outlets evolved from the Free Woman, a weekly humanist review, to the New Free Woman, an individualist review, too, and this is the famous one, the Egoist, an individualist review. Now, Marsden saw artists as model egoists, imagine that, and invited their contribution. So with editorial assistance from a very young Rebecca West and the bumptious expatriate American poet Ezra Pound, both in these pages on occasion alongside James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. And then it came to light that Marsden's editorial correspondence with such literary notables was still held by her family in Prescott in Wales. So I procured myself a summer stipend for a 6-week trip to the UK, spending several of those weeks in the company of Marsden's charming middle-aged niece, reading through her auntie's papers. This was 1985, before portable computers, let alone cell phone cameras. I didn't think to carry a typewriter with me. There was a photocopier somewhere in that small town, but it was too cumbersome to use except for exceptional items such as this holograph note from Pound to Marsden. For the most part, then, I sat in that second-floor study for days on end like some medieval scribe, hand-copying those papers into notebooks. And such were the humble beginnings of my 1996 book, Dora Marsden and Early Modernism. Well, it seems that my prior immersion in the little magazine culture of early Anglo-American modernism prepped me for a later immersion in the deep editorial backstories of the Whole Earth Catalog and Coevolution Quarterly. Akin to Marsden's operations, sort of, these publications are also product of the driving vision of a singular individual, that's Stuart Brand, with capable colleagues. And at least where the history of cybernetics is concerned, these are the premier publications of the American counterculture. Early on in this Systems Countercultures project, almost 20 years ago, I received the private donation of a nearly full set of Coevolution Quarterlies and Whole Earth Reviews, the nucleus of my own Whole Earth archive. Then I trolled the internet and purchased various iterations of the Whole Earth catalog proper. But nowadays, thanks to the recent debut of the online Whole Earth Index, which is really a fabulous thing, one has almost the entire run of these publications at one's digital fingertips. So this part of the archive is now way out in the public domain. So today, what I'm going to do is weave that public record around these first two of the Whole Earth publications. Weave that public record around the personal repository I have built up on what I have called the Systems Countercultures Network. So these documents in the aggregate shine much light on the intellectual relationships and conceptual resonances that inhabit the history of cybernetics writ large, especially as I will argue, and this is the sort of the argumentative thesis I will push in this talk today with regard to the dedication of the Systems Countercultures Network in particular to doing cybernetics in a biological, organismal key. Okay. All right, so here we go. So here's an expanded view of the Systems Countercultures Network. I hope that's readable. Anyways, I've got a handout that you can get. So here's the network in diagrammatic form, now adding in a few more key names and multiple indications of key texts. Each line here traces the thread of a story about a personal and/or intellectual relationship. For instance, picking up the larger story with the Macy conferences on cybernetics, neurophysiologist Warren McCulloch was at their intellectual center, as seen here at the center of the lead table. As this audience today knows well, these 10 meetings running from 1946 to 1953 laid down complex foundations for numerous strands of cybernetic development. Gregory Bateson and Margaret Mead were present in a number of these meetings, as was Heinz von Förster once he arrived in the States in 1949. McCulloch was equally instrumental in bringing von Förster to the University of Illinois, where he would set up the Biological Computer Lab in 1958, creating that major hub of cybernetic research activities over the next 2 decades. Okay, so all that's pretty standard, deep history of our topic. Next in line within my diagram is Stuart Brand, who's a second-generation beneficiary of the cybernetic tide for which McCulloch and von Förster were key fountainheads. From the inception of the Whole Earth publications, and Understanding Whole Systems section has appeared in most iterations, foregrounding salient lines of cybernetic thinking with reviews of pertinent texts, such as these notices of Norbert Wiener and W. Ross Ashby in the inaugural number of the catalog. And Brand cites the idiosyncratic systems thinker Buckminster Fuller as the leading inspiration for the global outlook of the Whole Earth sensibility, and Fuller's parallel conception of spaceship Earth, parallel to Whole Earth, was launched in the communication and control spirit of the first cybernetics. General system theory, cybernetics, and communications are prominent in the Whole Earth catalog excerpt here from Fuller's curriculum for design science in his 1969 volume Utopia or Oblivion. However, by 1974, as announced in the Whole Earth Epilogue and continuing throughout the 10-year run of Coevolution Quarterly, Gregory Bateson came forth as the leading luminary of the Whole Earth Network. Yep. Yeah. So by this time, Bateson himself had channeled the later harvest of his multifarious professional wanderings as a zoologist, a natural historian, as a cultural anthropologist, Macy Conference participant, social cyberneticist, psychotherapist, resident ethnologist at the Palo Alto VA Hospital, and director of dolphin research labs at both John Lilly's Communication Research Institute on St. Thomas and the Oceanic Institute on Oahu, Hawaii. He had channeled the later harvest of these wanderings into the tableau of environmental and systemic intuitions gathered in Steps to an Ecology of Mind in 1972. And in his headnote to the Whole Earth Epilogue here, Stuart Brand explained that with the release of Steps through Bateson, I became convinced that much more of whole systems could be understood than I thought, and that much more existed wholesomely beyond understanding than I thought. That mysticism, mood, ignorance, and paradox could be rigorous, for instance, and that the most potent tool for grasping these essences, these influence nets, is cybernetics. So for Brand, here was whole systems discourse taken to a new level of coherence, breadth of application, and topical relevance, especially for the psychedelic intelligentsia of his community. And as a warm-up exercise during the 3-year hiatus between the end of the first run of the Whole Earth Catalog in 1971 and the debut of Coevolution Quarterly in 1974, Brand publishes Two Cybernetic Frontiers, a monograph compiling 2 sizable magazine articles. One is on machine cybernetics, specifically the primeval video game Space Wars, then being played by the computer bums at Stanford late at night on idle mainframes. But the lead article, Both Sides of the Necessary Paradox, marks Brand's extensive initial report on Gregory Bateson's arrival within the system's countercultures. And in a coda to that Bateson chapter, in line with an announcement of the imminent launch of Coevolution Quarterly, in a kind of throwaway remark or significant hesitation, Brand hits upon an apt formula, and that's this quote here. He writes, as a Bateson enthusiast and a publisher, I'll be printing, I'll be printing sundry papers, speculation, gossip, tidbits, letters, etc. on cybernetics. Well, organic cybernetics, in the periodic supplement to the revived Whole Earth Catalog. So it seems to me that this corrected phrasing adds the vital difference that distinguishes the conceptual core of what I'm calling the system's countercultures, their various modes of adherence to the spirit of an organic cybernetics. I read this parenthetical moment in this occasional text here, a moment presided over by the profound and good nature of Bateson's mature discourse as an inadvertent declaration and admission of the priority of living systems proper to Brand's Whole Earth project. And that was so that the rightness of organic cybernetics in this moment was so even under the looming shadow of a nascent cyberculture already depriving the computer bums of regular sleep schedules. Now, Since in recent years I have published 2 books on Margulis Lovelock and the first and second order cybernetics of Gaia, making extensive use of these archival materials, I'm not going to go back over that ground in this talk, except to mention that part 2 of Gaian Systems is also titled The Systems Counterculture. My work on Gaia has long been informed by the profound relations connecting Margulis and Lovelock to the Whole Earth Network and the Lindisfarne Association. And 2, when read down the center, down this line, down the center line, as a narrative sequence, our diagram's climax arrives with the Lindisfarne Association and William Irwin Thompson's role in its early cultivation toward neo-cybernetic and Gaian bearings. So, Lindisfarne, in case you need a refresher here, was a private salon that began as an intentional community and then through direct connections with Brand's Whole Earth Network, tapped into the systems counterculture's embrace of Bateson's late work, tapped into the biological cybernetics of Maturin and Varela, and the planetary cybernetics of Margulis and Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis. So here, in this highly obscure but beautiful volume, for the record, in one splendid compendium, Gaia, A Way of Knowing, Political Implications of the New Biology, is a certain crest of the organic cybernetics celebrated by Coevolution Quarterly. And Thompson's New Biology is, in a way, the sequel to those organic cybernetics, now following out the autopoietic and cognitive lines between life and mind. But let's turn back to Heinz von Förster in the Biological Computer Lab to unravel a particular episode of support on Heinz's part for Maturana's most gifted student, Francisco Varela. Among the many generous actions von Förster took to help launch his expatriate scientific career after Varela's forced departure from Pinochet's Chile was introducing him to Brand's Whole Earth Network. The von Förster papers document this connection with a copy of a letter from Varela to Brand, responding to Brand's invitation to comment on Sagan's conjecture for potential publication in the Coevolution Quarterly. Let's dig in here for a moment. Sagan's conjecture first appeared in the same summer 1975 number with Margulis and Lovelock's The Atmosphere as Circulatory System of the Biosphere, the Gaia Hypothesis, as the featured article. We see one of Brand's standard editorial gambits at work, inviting multiple responses to a provocative question or issue, the better to generate curated copy for the magazine. He explains at the outset up here, one intended function of the CQ is to be a conversation pit for cooked and half-cooked cybernetic ideas. And then we get Sagan's conjecture. If the energy per pulse flowing through and interacting with a system is greater than the binding energy of the least strongly bound component of the system, then there will be a net loss of order in the system. Conversely, if the pulse energy is less than that of the weakest bond, there will be a net gain of order in the system. Well, Brand's discussion, continuing on, of this material energetic conjecture makes it clear that Carl Sagan means for it to account for the negentropic dynamics of biological systems based strictly on physical thermodynamical principles operating in a throughput linear fashion. So if this is cybernetics, it's certainly half-baked. His eponymous conjecture confirms that as a cosmologist, Carl Sagan, for all his exobiological flair, was still essentially a mainstream scientific thinker. That is, despite his commendable taste for marijuana, he was not a hardcore systems counterculture guy. What then did members of our chosen circle have to say about Sagan's conjecture? Well, Brand reports that, quote, Gregory Bateson was unthrilled by Sagan's conjecture. He distrusted its ambition to span too many levels of organization. Suppose you have a family or something. This is quoting Bateson. Suppose you have a family or something, a group of people who trust each other. Then you introduce the assertion that one of them is a spy. Does Sagan explain the net loss of order in the group? So I'm struck by the elegant way that Bateson's reported remarks parry Sagan's thrust. He simply restates Sagan's idiom of systemic bonds as referring not to physicochemical affinities, but to social ties. The implication is that the degree of social order in a family system, or say in an animal community, may be measured by the level of mutual trust in behavioral evidence there. So Bateson's family therapy application, let us say, deflates Sagan's conjecture's bid for universal application. Well, be that as it may, Brand persisted a bit longer in his interrogations on the matter of Sagan's conjecture. Presumably due to von Furster's boosting of his young protege, Brand appears to have offered Varela a shot at the Sagan question. And Varela's reply, dated September 11, 1975, would indicate that a relation of some familiarity already exists between them. So he's writing here, if you can read it, Dear Stuart, I would like to accept your invitation to comment. And Varela then states his thesis clearly, and what he writes here is, what I see as fundamentally wrong here is that both the notion of order and the notion of energy are strictly observer-bound, and here they are treated as entities in themselves, irrespective of the observer's framework. This is very misleading. Let me expand on this. And then Varela goes on to type out 2 packed single-space pages, omitted here, of classic second-order cybernetic rebuttal of the conjecture. 2 months later, by which time apparently Brand had demurred on its publication, Varela sends a copy of this letter to Heinz, who exercises superb professorial discretion in his own reply, and that's here in Heinz's letter where he writes, thanks also for letting me see your letter to Stuart Brand. We at the BCL humbly submit to you that you withdraw this letter. We suggest that you read it again with some distance from the time of writing, and by doing so, we know that you will know why we make this recommendation. So Heinz delicately intimates that the treatise Francisco contributed to that Coevolution Quarterly conversation was altogether too prolix and pedantic for the occasion. However, let's also note, in a short postscript to his over-lengthy letter to Brand, and that's here, P.S., P.S., Varela also mentioned, I'm also enclosing a copy of some ideas on the living organization, which I thought you might enjoy. And this seems likely to have been his recently released lean and lead-authored paper, Autopoiesis, the Organization of Living Systems, directly vetted by von Furster and published in Biosystems the year before. If so, Brand would have in hand all he needed to know about the brilliance and proper métier of his new correspondent. But whatever the case, the summer 1976 number of Coevolution Quarterly features a lengthy and quite superb interview with Varela on observing natural systems. Brand's headnote introducing this virtually unknown thinker to the larger coevolution quarterly audience places Varela squarely within the systems counterculture's inner circle. This is Brand. Francisco Varela is a mathematician and neurologist whose special interest is the logic of self-reference. This sounds abstruse, but I share the opinion of Ludwig Wittgenstein, Gregory Bateson, G. Spencer Brown, Heinz von Förster, and others, that failure to understand self-reference is the poison in the brain of most Western misbehavior. Public and personal, unquote. For good measure, Brand also exercises his editorial prerogative in lifting von Förster's Ouroboros, the emblem of self-referential recursion, from the 1974 BCL volume Cybernetics of Cybernetics, a massive student production financed with $10,000 from Brand's Point Foundation, and he appends it to the Varela interview. I take it as a marker of conceptual continuity. Now, taking this spin with the systems counterculture's network has clarified, I hope, the propriety of naming this band of systems thinkers as countercultural. It is not just that they all consorted with Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth Network. What's most important is what their conceptual orientations have in common. They all lay consistent, often insistent, cybernetic emphasis on living systems. As a gathering, they bring a coherent set of physiological, biological, and ecological approaches to issues of cognitive and communicational operation. Throughout the systems counterculture's literature, these themes run alongside, but in strong contrast to other points of view extended from idealizations or realizations of physical and mechanical systems. And we can bring the logic of this crucial contrast into focus with a brief glance now, as we're moving to a conclusion, a brief glance at Heinz von Förster's Coevolution Quarterly Review of Brand's Two Cybernetic Frontiers. Now, to garner a sympathetic review of his own book within his own magazine, Brand reached out to the affable and very quotable Heinz, who wrote, over here, "To know more about cybernetics from a man who helped in giving birth to this baby a quarter century ago was one of Brand's motivations to see Bateson in the first place. He recalled Bateson's statement in Steps to an Ecology of Mind. Quote, I think that cybernetics is the biggest bite out of the fruit of the tree of knowledge that mankind has taken in the last 2,000 years. But most of such bites out of the apple have proved to be rather indigestible, usually for cybernetic reasons." Immediately after citing Brand, citing Bateson's bracing biblical image for cybernetics from Steps to an Ecology of Mind, von Förster singles out a passage from Brand's chapter on Bateson in Two Cybernetic Frontiers that offers to explain to some extent why the fruit of cybernetics is so often hard to digest. Here Bateson disparages the ingrained linear logic of the mainstream engineering mentality that loosely parrots cybernetic idioms while watering down their more profound revelations, especially regarding autonomy or self-referential operation, or what precisely Bateson may have had in mind by, quote, the philosophy of the feedback. So Bateson, in that interview with Brand, had this to say: the whole thinking that goes with the words input and output is monstrously bad. It draws a line across the systemic structure. This actually throws away the whole cybernetic background for cybernetics, you know. The input-output literature is very large, it's highly skilled engineering and all the rest of it, but it ignores the philosophy of the feedback. Well, compare Francisco Varela in his 1976 Coevolution Quarterly interview. Here, Varela picks up the issue Bateson articulates in his critique of faux cybernetic linearity. Varela advances the philosophy of the feedback through an explicit discourse of self-referential closure, broadly applicable across a range of natural and artificial systems, but fundamentally discerned in the organization and operation of biological systems. And this is Varela now. As a matter of fact, a system is stable because of its closure of organization. That's the source of its stability. Now, this was already identified by Wiener in his central concept of feedback. The notion of feedback is a self-referential one, but it was seized by the engineers who made it appear hierarchical. They apply a reference signal, identify input and output, and the output affects the input with a little delay, so the self-reference becomes hidden underneath because of the trick of dealing with it in time. Now then, so to finish up, so following Bateson, Maturana, and von Förster, Varela completes a major arc in the countercultural development of systems theory as the most far-reaching discourses of cybernetics take upon themselves the second-order observation of recursive form, the paradoxically synchronic circularity that undermines the diachronic linear ideology of mainstream control theory. And one gets there, as Bateson himself suggests, self-referentially by considering, and now quote, going back to Bateson's quote, the whole cybernetic background for cybernetics, unquote. And this would seem to be von Förster's cybernetics of cybernetics by another route. So in the systems countercultures, in some, factoring different points of observation into the total picture of possible descriptions is no facile metaphysical gesture. Rather, it calls out and insists on the embodiment of cognitive systems, their embeddedness in fundamentally organic affordances. It is these renovations of biological systems thinking, I submit, that have taken the biggest bite out of the fruit of the tree of knowledge at the heart of the cybernetic revelation. Thank you.